All right, welcome back to another episode of the School Wrestling Podcast. Today I'm joined again by Heather Reid. Heather is a professor, a philosopher, and an author of a few different books based on the philosophy of sport, and I know you have a few others that I'm forgetting. But you've been on the podcast before, and today I wanted to talk to you about Arate, and I wanted to dive back into some of the areas that I think are related to Arate. And so to start, I wanted to kind of so when I started coaching, I started to really get into leadership. And when you get into leadership, like training, a lot of things that are talked about are cultural beliefs, right? So the belief of working hard is a cultural belief that sets the tone for the culture that um, uh, is, conducting the action, right? So culture drives a lot of the behaviors that create the outcomes. And so when you think about arate is the personal excellence of some kind, right? And so in wrestling, personal excellence, I wanted to come up with some sort of idea around personal excellence in wrestling, as far as like what does it mean to be excellent in the sport of wrestling. And the reason why I want to come up with some principles or some guidelines of like what it means to have arate or to get arate is because what I think is interesting, and again, this is probably related to other sports, but currently there's like a situation going on in Pennsylvania where a high school is getting in trouble for recruiting kids. And the response is that they're suspending the athletes that were recruited from competition. And this conversation of recruiting to select places is getting talked about and brought up. And I was at I helped coach at a school that was the top 5 team in the country. It was a private school. There was definitely like the recruiting of getting people to that school, right? Desiring certain individuals that possessed what we viewed as arate, and we wanted them to be on our team, right? And going back to last week, what we were talking about is how the role of competition and how your competition is what makes you better, right? And having an environment where there are a bunch of people that share the same cultural beliefs that you have, the same audacious goals that you might have, also the same skill sets that you might have, that is in what I would view as cultivating an environment of arate. And right now, we're looking at that environment and we're saying that's a bad thing. We shouldn't create that environment because it's cheating. And what I've experienced being at a school that was the top 5 team in the country, and I've also been a public school coach where we had to co-op multiple programs because it wasn't very good. And so now being at both of those places, what I notice is the cultural beliefs of achievement, of high achievement in athletics, of having the goal first and pushing yourself to the goal is ultimately what creates the arate. And what I've found is when you try to communicate the importance of trying to be elite or exceptional at the sport of wrestling, people suggest that that's taking it too serious, that that's not what it's about. And you and I have talked before about like in order to achieve arate, to cultivate arate, you have to reach your potential. You have to push yourself to the point where you are the highest version of yourself. And in order to do that, you have to have something in front of you that makes you do the act of getting better every single day. And oftentimes, yeah. And so what I'm trying to figure out is there a way to communicate arate or even elitism inside the athletic world without spending too much time arguing as to why outcomes happen, right? So when somebody loses, they want to excuse the fact that they're not in their arate, and it kind of gets all out of whack. So I was trying to come up with some sort of principles or something, but I
I
can
have
go from there.
three comments on what you said, that just to kind of clarify the discussion. The first one is you were talking about a culture of arte, and one of the things is when you talk about a culture, it can apply to lots of different groups. Like you can have a culture that involves like, like modern Western culture, right? And then you're talking about whole countries and regions and, all this stuff. A lot of people would say modern Western culture includes, Canada, the United States, Mexico, Western Europe, blah, blah, blah. Okay. So one of the things you're talking about when you're talking about a culture of excellence, you can have very vague, very widespread ideas of excellence. But you can also have a small community that has a culture of excellence, like you're talking about having a particular wrestling team that is embracing this idea of excellence. And then that would be kind of like a micro culture, or it's a culture that you're cultivating in this small community. And I think that there's a philosopher named Jesus Illinden, and he writes about now I can't even remember so much. We work together. We feed off each other ideas. And I can't remember if the term is mine or his, but I basically called it a performance community, where like within a team or a small group of people. And this happens even when some of the people are your opponents, actually often when it's your opponents, because your opponents are the ones who really understand you and your commitment to excellence and the way you're devoting your life this way. And I call that a performance community. And I think that in elite sport, you get that, a performance community where you have several people who are really dedicating themselves to excellence or arte in this sport, and they can understand each other and they form a kind of camaraderie of friendship that where they often, like I said, a lot of times the people are your opponents, but they make you better through their strength. And so I can see why, you would want to recruit people who have that culture or appreciate that culture, and how people who have that culture want to be with other people like that. I don't want to be with somebody who doesn't take sports seriously. I don't want to be with somebody who goes out drinking Friday night. I want to be with other people like me who are really trying to achieve excellence. And so there's a lot to be said for that. And so a culture that you can have in a small community and what you might call a performance community. But one thing kind of to push back on that, an important thing about arte is, remember, arte is the best version of yourself. And the best version of yourself may not also be the best wrestler that you could be. So sometimes there's a tension between your the athletic result that you're able to achieve and what's the best version of yourself. Like most people would say, especially for young people, that you shouldn't totally compromise your education, for example, or your social education, or whatever else it is, in order to really become awesome at a sport. And this is, I think, especially true for children. And a lot of people are concerned about, like the classic example is the female gymnasts who, start training full time really young and basically dedicate their whole life to reaching their peak at, some age like 16. And then they don't end up being the best versions of themselves on this narrative because they've neglected some other important part of childhood and so on. So, I mean, I do think that one of the things about arte is it's not purely athletic. It can't be purely athletic. So when you talk about arte, what's arte for wrestling? It's not that arte is different for wrestling than it is for, reading Latin. The difference is that the qualities of arte, like classic courage, self-control, respect, these kinds of qualities that are fundamental in arte, they just get played out differently in different activities. So the wrestler who has arte is going to show courage and respect and self-control and how they train and how they compete and all that. But you can show that in other things. And so one thing is you don't want to confuse skill or even success in a sport with arte, because arte are the qualities that should be cultivated through and expressed, and they should lead to good results in sport. But that's also not always true. It could be that you end up ruining, you become you could be, a horrible person who fails to respect your competitors, and then somehow you could still be successful as an athlete, but you wouldn't have arte.
Yeah. So how would you measure what's possible though, without like going like, so, I never won a state title. So maybe somebody could say that my athletic skill wasn't good enough to win a state title. However, my pursuit of the state title and I would say, my openness, my stupidity of thinking that I could become a state champion. That's what pushed me to develop some of the characteristics that I think are very important today. So athletically, although I
Why do you call it
failed,
stupidity?
well, just the idea that,
Maybe you
you,
were in the wrong state, I mean.
no, definitely. I mean, I beat other kids that were state champions in other states, but my point being is, I think there's a level of, I don't know, ignorance that you go, oh, I could do that without knowing whether or not you could actually achieve it. It's that
Yeah.
you believe that you could do anything to the point that you push yourself to try to accomplish that thing. Even when you fail chasing that thing, it's the act of chasing that thing that's what created the growth in the first place.
Oh,
So,
exactly. Yeah, yeah, yeah. In
but
fact, and if you never failed, you may never, I mean, if you think of it, sometimes I say that sport is philosophical in the sense that it's trying to find the truth. And I think, especially when you're young, what you're trying to do is find a truth about yourself. Like, can I be the state champion? And of course, you have to believe that you can in order to put everything in place to compete for that. So let's say you fail. Okay, so you weren't the state champion, but you found all of these great qualities in yourself, and some of your limitations. And that knowledge is super valuable, whether or not the external, actually win this contest. Which,
so
when you think about it, is kind of silly, because you could win the contest without having the knowledge, or without, by some fluke or whatever. And then you really wouldn't have anything as valuable as the knowledge you got in pursuing that goal. So
so
what I'm saying is that the sport result is not necessarily a measure of the good that you got out of sport.
absolutely. So whenever I coach and somebody fails, I try my hardest to remind people that your identity is not attached to the sport, right? Like, you're not a loser because you lost, right? You're victorious because you tried. So,
Yeah.
the idea that, like, but so when you enter a sport, what
I was
should
gonna say,
be what
I
should be
always
the
used to
goal?
say I beat everybody who didn't show up on the starting line, because I was a bicycle racer, right? So the first thing, to sort of psych myself up, you get there, you get on the starting line, or whatever your point of competition is, and you think about, and of course, you want to win, and of course you have to recognize that you might lose. And I used to always sort of say to myself, yeah, but you beat everybody who didn't show up. So so when you say it's victorious, I mean, in a way you
Yeah.
are, just because you're taking the risk.
But so when you start a sport, so when you engage in sport, like, the goal is arete, but how do you set forth into the sport? Right. So, like, what is the outcome that you're after when you start into sport? Like, if you want to, if you're supposed to want to win the game, right? So I thought about this. Like, the point is to win the game.
Right.
So if you don't want to win the game, like, should you not participate in the activity?
Well, no, the point is not to win the game. The point of the game is to win the game.
But
The point, the game, it is baked into, people say, well, winning doesn't matter in sport. And that's just wrong, because it's baked into a game. The object of the game is to win. So if you, there's a philosopher named Bernard Suits used to call it trifling. If you play a game and you don't care whether you win or lose at all, you're not even trying to win, you're not respecting the sport. You're not even, that's not really being an athlete. That's not respecting the sport. The point of participating in sport as a lifestyle, which is completely different than just the competition. So many people think of sport as competition, where really in the life of any athlete, competition is a relatively small amount of what you do. So the decision to engage in the lifestyle of the athlete, the goal of that is to become a better person. So this is different. See what I'm saying?
yeah, no, I definitely agree. But how do you get how do you get someone to engage in the act of being an athlete to its fullest potential without having an external goal that makes them push themselves past the point of, the testing of yourself, the expansion of yourself? So if you get a 6 year, like, if you get a group of kids that are engaging in sport, and they're, running around and they're learning, right? How do you get somebody to engage in that process even more intentionally, right? So they run a little bit harder at practice. They listen a little bit more intently. They care about the details. They go outside of practice and they do more, and they think about it more, and they try to find other resources to make them better. How do you do that without having someone have a measuring stick in which they're supposed to go after?
Well, I think you do want a goal. I mean, just like you were saying, your goal was to be the state champion. And what the goal does is, the goal for me is a kind of a question, in the sense that it's not a question what you have to do. Being a state champion is very clear what you have to do. Um, I think all athletes, they used to tell, set your goals, write them down, give the amount of time, what year you would like to do this, and you have a kind of a logical progression. But what those goals are in sport are a proxy for the kind of person that you would like to be. And you think, look, if I really fulfill my highest potential, I'll be state champion, say. And then what you might run into is that your highest potential is actually not state champion, it's regional champion or whatever. But by setting your goal, you had to set a really high goal even to just kind of explore that possibility. You need, it's like, I don't want to call it a measuring stick, because goals are really good for sort of setting up a problem. I like the way you describe it. And I remember thinking about that myself. I wanted to make the Olympic team. I wanted to compete in the Olympics. And it was like a big puzzle. It's like, how do I live my life? How do I, do every little thing that I do in a way that it most contributes to being able to compete at this level? And in the end, I never did make it to the Olympic Games. But as I went on, I learned more about myself. I also learned more about the goal and what it would take. And actually, in my case, at a certain point, after I'd been to the Olympic trials twice, but not quite made it to the final round, I realized that to continue on, there were certain, like, for example, I had always continued my education. And if I really wanted to push harder, I might have to do some things that I didn't want to do, including not pursuing my studies. And so I ended up, pursuing my studies. But wouldn't say it was a failure, and I wouldn't say, well, you shouldn't have had that goal because you're just going to fail. I think the goal, by challenging me, pushed me better. Remember, we talked about the basic function of sport as something that sets up challenges that make us better. And what do we call it? A voluntary effort to overcome unnecessary obstacles. So sports are these things that set up challenges that try to make us be better. And the goals are a way of expressing a challenge. It's like setting a challenge for yourself, kind of, within sport, that will push you to be better. But I don't think you are measured by whether it's ironic or paradoxical. I don't think your progress is necessarily measured by whether or not you reach the goal. And in both ways, not only that, even if you fail to reach the goal, it means you didn't get as good as you thought, or you didn't have as much arete as you thought you had. It could be that you achieved the goal, but that doesn't represent the level of arete you were going for, because there could have been some outside, like I said, maybe you lived in the wrong state, or what the competition was at your point, or there could be all these other kind of factors. Sport is not a super reliable measurement of our best versions of ourselves.
Yeah. But so going back into, so I've noticed whenever you ask kids, like, what are your goals? They almost always first always default into the ideas of what you think, or what they think you want them to say.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly.
So if a parent asks their child, what do you want? What do you want out of the sport? They'll say, the highest thing, right? They'll say, I want to be a state champion, because that's what is communicated. But then throughout the process, right, they will be met with challenges, right? They will lose, right? They will fail. And the response isn't to address the idea that if your goal is to win a state title, then you're not doing enough, right? Or you're not as good as you need to be, or you need to put forth more effort. And it's oftentimes because I think when people are in failure, people around them want them to feel better. And so even if an individual isn't capable of winning a state title, when they fail, if they are focused on the ideas of still not putting forth enough effort or energy towards this thing, they won't step it up after the failure, right? Because how do you respond to failure? Like if you
That's
go through
interesting.
failure, like how do you respond to failure
Yeah.
in order for it
Usually
to
though, when
grow
you
on itself?
fail, you go, all right, why did I fail? And sometimes the answer is a lack of effort, although not always. I think that could be too simplistic. I know in my sport of cycling, overtraining is a big problem. Um, and so it's not always lack of effort. Sometimes it's not, it's not being smart, or it's not being balanced, or it's not, getting enough rest. There's a million things, and that's what makes it so challenging and so great. But I think that I would say if somebody, as soon as they fail, they lose interest in getting better, then they probably weren't really necessarily interested in arete and becoming a better version of themselves. They were interested in something else, either getting approval from, mom and dad or peers or somebody, or, anybody who, I once had I sometimes I hear students say, I like this class because it's easy. And I think that's it. I'm like, I'll be advising students, college students, on what classes to take. And they say, oh, I heard that class is really easy. It's really easy to get an A. Like, well, then why do you want to take it? I mean, if it's easy and you don't, learn a lot, it's not challenging, then why do you want to spend all this money and waste your time? It's the same thing. It's like, why don't you take chemistry? Well, I don't know anything about chemistry. That's why you take a class in chemistry, right? So this idea of challenging ourselves is I think it's really characteristic of success in athletics and in other things. And so people who want it to be easy are, I think they don't have an athletic attitude. And I think, arete, Plato said famously, Plato was the great philosopher of arete, and he said, nothing good is easy. So the idea is, yeah, there's easy things, but it doesn't make it good.
Well, and this goes back to my point. So when I think about wrestling, I go, okay, wrestling is difficult. When you ask somebody, you think wrestling is hard or easy, they say hard. So when somebody's going through wrestling, it should be hard. It shouldn't be easy. And
Right.
so defining what it is to be hard, simplifying it down to the start of it is just like physically pushing yourself, exhausting yourself.
Right. Yeah.
And so, how do you conduct? So going back to the original thing about the issue with this high school recruiting kids who are pursuing arete and trying to create an environment of arete, and how do you, so the reason why they're getting in trouble are other programs who don't necessarily exude enough arete to attract people to come there, or are building enough people to become competitive. They're basically upset at the competitive advantage that those individuals have. I know from my experience at a public school, there were 10% of that, I would say maybe 40%. 40% of the population were okay with the idea that wrestling is difficult and hard and it's challenging, and they're going to push themselves every single day. And then I have 60% that think that that's taking it too far, that sport is just an activity, that they're just supposed to be able to go there after school and participate at their own leisure, not what the environment of the group is.
Yeah.
And so,
Recreational. Yeah.
and so in wrestling, it's really like an orchestra, right? And so you have 30 wrestlers, and if you get 20 of them in an environment of working and creating a pace, creating a focus, creating an intensity, and then there are 10 individuals who are completely not wanting to be there. They're lazy. They don't take instruction. They do not care about arete in sport. They don't care about the sport itself. They're there because of other reasons. And I'm not necessarily sure of all those reasons.
Mhm.
How do you navigate that world? And I think for me personally, looking at wrestling, knowing that in iron sharpens iron, arete is an environmental thing, is real. If you have 30 people that all want to push themselves to the maximum, then they will push you to become better as well, right? So the environment matters, but how do you navigate an environment if you can, a small percentage of the population is okay with not taking it serious?
Well, I mean, the sport will sort of, they won't have much success in the sport. It's interesting when you talk, part of what occurs to me is, well, I had two thoughts. One is people say, oh, they just want to do this for fun. They don't want to do it very hard. And it reminded me of the students, I want to take this class that's easy. Whereas it seems like if somebody came to you, a child came to you and said, look, I just want to take the classes, school part, my English class, I just want to take it easy. I don't want to do too well in it. Seems like a lot of people say, what do you mean you don't want to do too well? Put the effort in. This is school. You should take this seriously. And then, but there are people that they would say that about any kind of academic course, but then when it comes to sports, they go, well, you shouldn't take that too seriously. So on the one hand, it may be that they don't see sport as an educational activity. They see it as recreation. And sport can be recreation. Watching TV could be recreation. Playing instruments could be recreation. But you could also, play an instrument to try to be really good at it, just like you can play sport to try to be really good at it. And that, I think, is what's educational. So one thing might be just a confusion between a sport as an educational activity and just recreation. The other concern, though, so I would say that, and I would say that's wrong, that really, if you're going to do sport, do it so that it makes you a better person. But one issue has to do with, kind of the eggs in the basket argument that, we all have only so much energy and only so much time. And if our sport demands a disproportionate amount of our energy and time, we may not give enough attention to other things that are important, oftentimes like academics or like things like that. So the idea behind Arte is that it's not confined to one particular activity. And so you will try your best in at least key things. I mean, I don't think everybody has like 40, like you have 47 activities and you try your best on all of them. It's sort of impossible. If you have so much work, you can't do your best job in everything you're doing, or at least the really core things, then there's a problem. And I think that's one, when they talk about taking it too serious, they mean putting so much time and energy into it. I don't have time and energy for my homework. I don't have time and energy to also be a good student of things like that. And that, I think, is a danger. But on the other hand, you don't want to be mediocre at everything either.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, I think that, and I don't think, and you can't be excellent at lots of things. You can be excellent at maybe more than one thing. But so there's something to be said, I think, especially with youth, since as I've said many times, sport is ultimately meaningless. The good of it comes from, you becoming better through this, because then you can apply that arete to other more meaningful things once you're, like finding a cure for cancer, once you've gotten your education up to that level. The thing about sport is at a very young age, you can put all of your effort and time and energy into it and get these results and get these tests. And that really teaches you about trying to become excellent at something, at performing some task. And that lesson, I think, is really important. So one of the things is, if you're going to take sport just recreationally, then I hope you're taking something else seriously. I hope you're trying to be excellent in something else, because learning how to be excellent at something is important.
Yeah.
And not just trying to get by. I mean, I've had so many students in my career, they just try to get by with a minimum. And they just try, whatever they're going to get, whatever the grade they want. So then they blame the professor. They don't give them the grade they want. It's like, you could have done better. Oh yeah, but I didn't need to. My other professors don't make me do better than this. They give me good grades for doing this, crappy work. I feel like, come on, you need to try to be the best version of yourself. And so, yeah. And so I think there's that question of commitment, but real arete would mean trying to be excellent in several things.
Yeah.
And if you're a student, then that would be also something you would try to be excellent in.
Yeah, I love what you said. And like, my own awareness or experience around this is like I had an affinity towards school as well. I had straight A's until I was a freshman in high school. But once I got focused into wrestling, I just didn't care that I got straight A's or not. It wasn't something that I was pursuing for my own personal sake, right? I attached myself to, oh, I love wrestling. I'm fascinated with achieving more in wrestling. Physically, you're developing, you're everything kind of like encourages you, that fostering of more and more focus and discipline and determination, right? And like, just thinking it back to my own ability from a maturity standpoint, if you were to say, hey, focus on school, you can't wrestle, there's nothing, I would not probably have motivation or even the desire to pursue that. I just wasn't mature enough to think of education in the sense that you needed to expand your mind for many reasons, economic reasons, social reasons. I was not aware of that stuff. However, because of the aspects of sport, they don't require, like, it actually, like, maturity almost comes through the process of sport sometimes, where every time you push yourself, you become a little bit more mature than somebody who definitely isn't. And so it's like one of those things where I think, like, again, like you said, you're trying to teach yourself how to be excellent in other things that you do. Well, if you take sports serious, you will understand a process or a system, right? Like, I like to think of a system thinking that comes from wrestling and sports in general. You got to do these things over and over again, and through that process, you'll get better. Well, then after that, you'll be able to extract that process and say, oh, I want to do this. What do I have to do? I have to apply the same process. And so it's like, from a maturity standpoint, like, again, I've had this conversation with somebody where, when kids don't do well in school, they're not allowed to participate in sport. And it's like, what if by not participating in sport, you're actually, you're taking away an educational opportunity that then that person could reapply later on in life, because they simply weren't interested in so-and-so's English class. Because again, the difference is, if you were teaching philosophy, I'm fascinated, I'm interested, but you're not the teacher that's at a random high school in a Midwestern town, right? Like, so that person might not be a very good educator. And so because that person might not be a very good educator, you might not be inspired or motivated to pursue arate in that specific thing. So it's like, whatever is able to trigger that inspiration towards arate should be able to be concerned as an educational experience.
I definitely think so. I mean, I think that often I reflect that as a scholar that, for me, reading is like training. I know that in order to have a good performance in creating good work, I have to do all of the work, all the preparation. You get into a certain kind of, mental fitness, and you get into a certain amount of knowledge, and then you're able to do something with it. Just like as an athlete, by piling on all this training and competition and experience, you're able to put on a better and better performance. So again, like this idea of a performance culture that we were talking about, and with children especially, I think that they, like you say, you get a passion for sport, and sport will teach you that you have to work hard, that you have to, not just do whatever you want all the time, that you have to deal with failure, that you have to do all these things in order to be excellent at the sport. And it's true in any kind of performance thing. Again, I mean, I mentioned music, but ultimately almost every profession is some kind of performance. Sales, being a lawyer, being a doctor, coaching, teaching, anything you think, it's a performance, and it involves taking a lot of knowledge and experience and everything, putting it into a really good performance. And so, being able to, you can become excellent at sport at a very young age while you're still immature, like you said. You can, reach after excellence and get a lot. And then actually the other thing about sport, and maybe this is good, after a fairly young age, you can't really be that excellent anymore. And in most sports, after about 30, it's very hard, you're going to at best plateau and then eventually go down. And so in a way, youth is a good time to pursue excellence through sports, so you can learn about pursuing excellence and be able to have that later in life, and be able to deal with, we're talking about losing. to learn from losing, you got to really want to win. And sometimes I wonder when people, they don't care if they win or lose, it's really that they're afraid of losing. You got to want to win, and you have to, losing's got to hurt so that you can, like I said, be motivated to try, to do better the next time, or just, it'll stop you and get you to think.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So just, kind of reinforcing this idea. I think you just said, if you don't want to win, then it's going to be difficult for you to pursue your arete, or your pursue better, right? To not care.
Yeah.
And so like, shouldn't we be able to, or should we just generalize? Like, I think, what I'm trying to get at is, like, what we were saying is not every single person is athletically capable of winning a state title, but couldn't that be the collective goal? So if a child or a person isn't understanding philosophy, isn't understanding arete, like, what is the most practical thing that you could attach to arete that says, this is why you wrestle? You have to pursue getting a college scholarship. Like, I'm not necessarily saying that that's a good one, but by saying this is the goal of it, at least that is setting you on a trajectory of, like, going after it. Whether or not you get it or not is actually a display of, like, the work and effort and skills that you possess.
Yeah. And there should be a progression, right? I mean, you don't go, take somebody and say, okay, you got to be a state champion. I mean, there are different steps along the way. And that's part of the lesson. Nobody just goes, I mean, I meet a lot of people who, if they can't be really, really good at something right away, they don't want to deal with it. Like I live in a foreign country. I have to speak foreign language. I've had to learn ancient Greek and learn some other language. Learning is slow and difficult and repetitive, and it takes a long time. And people say, oh, wow, you speak that foreign language. It must be easy for you. It's not easy for me. It took a lot of time, but eventually you get good. But some people say, oh, I don't have time for that. Or, so they buy this thing, learn Italian in 10 minutes or something. And nobody ever does it that way. So I think that, we are taught that things that seem hard are really easy, and we want things that are hard to be really easy. But when it comes to performance, to being excellent in performance, whatever it is, it's not easy. And you can learn that from sport right away. And one reason you need a goal, like, if it's state champion or whatever it is, or if it's just beating this one person, is that pushes you to do a little better than, because I think not natural, but our tendency as humans a lot of times is to want to try the easiest way to do something. And sport will teach you that the easiest way to do something is not good.
Well, that goes back to what I was, so again, my background, I'm from a very, very small town, 20,000 people. No one in my family was like an exceptional wrestler growing up. Athletics were not like preached as like the only thing that mattered. The only thing that was preached when I was a young child was, whatever you're going to do, try to be the best at it.
Yeah.
And it was preached over and over again. And so, when I think about what it means to be the best at something, I've heard other coaches say, everyone, you should make goals that are, what's the word?
Realistic.
Yes. Realistic. Right. And I don't think I ever made a realistic goal, because I thought making a realistic goal was silly, because realistic goals, you don't have to become somebody entirely different. And like, for instance, I as a coach, so oftentimes I'll ask people who are pretty good, right? So I'm not just doing this with everybody, but people who have potential. I say, what are your goals? And somebody will say, I want to win conference. And I'll say, that's your goal? That's what you want to do? Yeah. It's like, well, conference isn't that hard to win in this conference, right? Like, I won 4 conference titles. Like, for me, like, going back to my own experience, like, I won 4 conference titles. So I didn't look at that as like such a deal. But if I wasn't pursuing a state title, maybe I wouldn't have won 4 conference titles. Maybe I wouldn't have actually, blew past the idea of realistic goals. And so, I always default into going, just be audacious, go to the craziest goal. Like, that's what I go back to, the ignorance as to, like, for me to tell my parents I wanted to win a high school state title. Oh, this kid's crazy. He don't even know how to wrestle. Right. But I made that goal in seventh grade. So in seventh grade, I made a goal that was very, very, audacious, because I had never won a state at that point. And it was that goal it was that ultimate goal of winning a state title that pushed me to do all sorts of other things that I'm very proud of. But I don't look back and say those were that challenging, because I became something that made those things not very challenging.
I mean, I do think that one of my regrets when I got to the end of my athletic career was that I hadn't celebrated big accomplishments I made that were not my goal. So like I think probably the biggest thing I ever won was a national collegiate title. But I wanted to be the national champion. And so winning the collegiate title, I sort of poo-pooed it at the time. And I looked back and I said, you should have, opened a bottle of champagne. That was pretty good. Because I think as athletes, we're so focused on the big goal that sometimes we don't appreciate the little things we make. So I'm a little hesitant to say, don't have realistic goals or whatever, but you should. I think it is important to maybe it's important to have unrealistic goals. It's definitely to have something that forces you to be the best version of yourself. Because if you can win the conference title without being the best version of yourself, then you really haven't achieved you haven't reached your potential in terms of arete. And so if it takes you imagining yourself as an Olympic champion in order to get good enough to become the state champion, then it was worth imagining yourself as an Olympic champion, even if you don't have whatever it takes to the raw materials or whatever else it took to get there.
Yeah. But don't you also think that failure, so again, failure, how do you respond to failure correctly? How do you respond to failure with the maximal response? And so, like, for instance, my junior year, I got second in the state. Now, this was the first time I made it to the high school state finals, and it was a really good accomplishment, right? Like, very few people do it, and I did it. After losing in the state finals, I took my medal and I threw it. I got rid of it, and my mom later went up later and got it, and she kept it and stuff like that. But I hated it. I really did not care about it. I wanted it to be in the garbage.
Yeah.
The work that I put in from that point to my senior year was just incredible compared to the year before, because of my maturity and my true disappointment with that loss.
Yeah.
If I would have stopped and said, oh, this was awesome, I don't know if I would have had the same fire inside.
Yeah.
And so, I think it comes to, again, my view is that it comes back to this philosophical point of view of coaches and parents and community to look back on the journey at the end and say, hey, that was great. You did phenomenal. You became somebody who very few people have the courage to become. And it's like, it's not to do in the moment. It's almost like it's a way to do it at the end to make sense of your experience. But in the moment, if I stop and try to give myself credit or feel good about a performance that's not what I was after, I feel like I wouldn't have had that added motivation to push myself even further than before. And it's one of the reasons why I think winning matters. And when you lose, it does feel bad, and it should feel bad.
Well, especially if you didn't play your best. Sometimes,
but even what if your best isn't good enough? That should
that's still more. If I play my best and I lose and my best isn't good enough, I found that out, and that's satisfying. If I lost because I failed to do this or I failed to do that or something, then it makes more sense for me to be mad at myself. But I think that, there's also the idea of, trying to get to be the best that you can be. And that there's value in that. I think those things are good. I know what you're saying. I don't think you want to forget what your long-term goals are, the best version of yourself is, and think you've gotten there. Because I think for some people too, it depends on talent. Some people have too good of results too soon, and then they don't get the real virtues that they need. Say some people can be really talented in some sports. They're able to win things without really training, without working hard. Once you start getting to the really high levels, everybody's got talent. Everybody works hard. It's no longer one or the other. And then that's good. Again, it keeps pushing us, and that's the way it should be.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I liked it. Either way, I like talking about this. I'm trying to figure out maybe a better way to, because again, it's kind of a paradox, right? Like you're trying to, you know, use sport in this way that creates virtue, but at the same time, in order to somewhat create that virtue, you really have to care about the sport more than other things. And it's like trying
Yeah.
to navigate that as a coach to inspire people, or not even inspire, but like, for instance, demand, saying like, if you're going to be coached by me, you have to be someone who wants to pursue an audacious highest version of themselves. And I'm not going to allow for any standard that is less than that.
Here's an idea too, just to kind of a way of doing it, like a first little step. Maybe instead of saying that my goal is a state championship or winning a thing, you should say my goal is to be state champion. Because you're talking about being a kind of a person, and it's a kind of a person who deserves to be the state champion, which you in your mind will mean that you deserve, that you have certain virtues and you've wrestled at a certain level. You've managed to create a kind of performance that merits that title. So if we think about our goals in terms of versions of ourselves or that we want to be, that'll help us to cultivate arete through the pursuit of sporting goals, right? Because you want to be this kind of person. And that's, I think that there's a lot to that. And then sometimes there's somebody who wins that who turns out to not be the kind of person you want to be. But if I'm going to be state champion, I want to be this kind of state champion. I think that there's a value in that.
Yeah, I agree. I from my own experience and from my experience as a coach, I often say, whatever your goals are, now go write down, what do you think that the person who achieves that goal should do on a daily and weekly basis?
Good. Yeah. Good.
Yeah. Because early on, that's how I kind of learned. It's like, what do you think they're doing on every Monday during season? Or, and that is honestly, I agree. That's one of the best ways to objectively go, okay, I'm worthy of these types of accomplishments. But all right. Well, Heather, thank you again for chatting with me, and I will talk to you soon. You enjoy the next 2 weeks. And
okay, I'll see you then.
Yep. Thanks again. See ya.
Bye-bye.